Hi, I'm Erik Voss, and Stranger Things' second season is here. And once again, thank you to my parents' Netflix login for a weekend of screams, tears, laughs, and nerdy jokes with a little cane here. Of course, Stranger Things is so much more than a list of 80s references, but really a key part of this show's success is the way it evokes and connects to these pop culture icons of our collective pasts. That's right, like it or not, Spielberg directed all of our childhood. So let's do this. 80 or so details you might have missed from Stranger Things Season 2. Spoilers ahead if you haven't seen the full season yet. What are you even doing here, you mouth breather? And real quick, this video was sponsored by Movement Watches and Sunglasses. Check out the description below for more info or stick around to the end for details on a special offer. Cool, let's get started. The opening image of the second season is a starry night sky, which might look familiar to you. For one, it's the same exact shot that opened Season 1, but also both of these shots are referencing the opening shot of E.T., the extraterrestrial. E.T. is obviously one of the biggest cultural influences on Stranger Things, and let's run through all of the many pop culture influences in our section, Under the Influence. And let's start with the E.T. references. The show leans back into the E.T. connection in Season 2 when Will says his favorite candy.
Reese's Pieces?
Of course, Reese's Pieces are the candy Elliot uses to lure E.T. into his bedroom. Later in the season, Dustin develops a similar relationship with Dart, aka Baby Demogorgon, aka Demo Dog, feeding him his favorite Halloween candy, Three Musketeers, and later leading him with slices of bologna. Also, notice how Dustin has an E.T. statue on his nightstand in his bedroom, and on Halloween night, Dustin's mother dresses in a similar black cat costume that Elliot's mother wears in E.T. And when Eleven wears a white ghost sheet, hoping Hopper will take her out trick-or-treating, that's also a nod to E.T.'s Halloween costume disguise. But the fact that it's a jump scare here reminded me of Michael Myers' disguise in Halloween. We actually see Max later scare the boys with the regular Mike Myers costume. Eleven's ghost sheet also reminded me of that awesome scare in Paranormal Activity 3, which I know isn't an 80s movie. Not all these references are going to be in the 80s, but at least that movie was set in the 80s. Another influential 80s franchise was the Alien movies, which was lightly touched on in Season 1 with the Demogorgon xenomorphy design, but Season 2 takes it to a whole new level. And it starts with the casting of Paul Reiser as Dr. Sam Owens. Reiser memorably played Carter Burke in Aliens, the untrustworthy Weyland-Yutani company man who says, "I work for the company, but don't let that fool you, I'm really a good guy." Owens definitely evokes that untrustworthiness.
I need you to realize I'm on your side.
Of course, as the season goes on, Owens actually ends up redeeming himself, staying behind to save Hopper and the others, which is the exact opposite of what Burke did to the crew in Aliens. Meanwhile, Dustin, wanting to keep a dead Demodog for science, is exactly the clearly idiotic thing Burke or Ash would do. Joyce, don't ever open that fridge. Now, the way Season 1 heightens to Season 2 is clearly inspired by the way James Cameron upped the ante with Aliens. Whereas the first season featured one lone monster slowly stalking its victims, the second season multiplies the threat, dialing up the action. Even the Demogorgon biology is borrowing from the xenomorph. It incubates and implants inside Will the way the xenomorph facehuggers do, and it ends up crawling away and growing into a larval stage that molted as it outgrows its slimy exoskeleton like the chestburster. Also, the Demodogs are quadrupedal variants on the original form, much like the xenomorph runner in Alien 3. And the shot of Mew Mew hissing at Dart in the trap is a nod to Jonesy the cat hissing at the xenomorph in Alien. And my favorite sequence of the season, when Owens sends soldiers down into the Demogorgon death trap, this is all a recreation of the scene in Aliens, when Burke watches as a soldier's heat signal dots get swarmed on radar and they get taken out one by one. They even included this line.
"All right, stay frosty, boys."
Which is a direct quote from the soldiers in Aliens.
"But stay frosty."
Now, another big influence was the film The Goonies, Richard Donner and Steven Spielberg's pirate adventure classic, which of course inspired the casting of Sean Astin, Mikey from that movie, perhaps the namesake of Mike Wheeler. Here, Astin plays Bob Newby, who's pretty much a grown-up Mikey. He's a nerd who's handy with DIY gadgetry and not too rattled by an adventure. And he makes the most obvious, eye-rolly self-reference of the season.
"What's at the X? Pirate treasure?"
Season 2 goes even further with this Goonies parallel, with Steve filling in as Josh Brolin's character, the reluctant older brother dragged along but still feels responsible for the kids. Now, last season I pointed out how the character of Dustin was kind of a mix of Mouth and Chunk, and in the finale, him calming down Dart with a Three Musketeers is very similar to Chunk calming down Sloth with the baby Ruth. Also, notice what the scientist says when the Demodog comes out of the pit.
"Mother Mary, just..."
Now, maybe that's just me, but this reminds me of the end of the Goonies when the adults realize this kid's story is actually real.
Holy Mary, Mother of God.
Now, in addition to Goonies, if you listen closely, Bob's childhood also seemed to come from another 80s source material, Stephen King's It. Notice the story he tells Will in episode 3.
And there he is, Mr. Baldo.
Hey, kiddo, would you like a balloon?
Would you like a balloon, huh? Didn't another creepy clown say that?
Do you want a balloon too, Georgie?
Oh God. Okay, like the kids from It, Bob grew up in Maine, and he says that he stood up to this clown. And if you think about it, the timeline does work out, because in the book, the kids grew up in the 50s, which is when Bob would have been in Maine. Now, obviously, I don't think they're saying that Bob was an actual member of the Losers Club. It's just fun to see how he's the type of kid who would have been. The works of Stephen King are definitely an influence on Stranger Things. As was the case last season, Eleven's psionic abilities are definitely inspired by books like Carrie and Firestarter. And once again this season, the kids walk the railroad tracks like the kids in Stand By Me, a movie adapted from King's The Body. Stand By Me also seems to influence another character who's new, Billy. He's the psychotic bully with a blonde mullet, just like Kiefer Sutherland's character. He also seems based partly on Rob Lowe's character from St. Elmo's Fire, who is also named Billy. I picked up some traces of Breakfast Club John Bender in there, but according to actor Dr. Montgomery, the Duffers told him to watch Jack Nicholson in The Shining, another Stephen King adaptation. Billy's sadistic cackling as he fights with Steve definitely seems inspired by Nicholson. This season also features a number of aerial overhead shots of cars on rural roads, which could be nods to Kubrick's opening shots of The Shining. And the look of the shadow monster as it emerges from the clouds in Will's vision seems to be pulled from The Mist, another King adaptation. The movie version of The Mist was directed by Frank Darabont, who also adapted King's Rita Hayworth in The Shawshank Redemption, and episode 6 pays homage to Darabont's iconic shot as the camera crawls back from behind the poster of said Rita Hayworth. Now, season 2 is set in 1984, so now the kids' world is populated with tons of great Ghostbusters details. Obviously the boys' Halloween costumes and the repeat use of Ray Parker Jr.'s theme song, but also in Dustin's bedroom, notice how he has this Ghostbusters certificate of anti-paranormal proficiency. You got one of these if you were in the fan club. Zooming and enhancing on this thing, it authorizes you to eradicate, exterminate, exorcise, and or entrap any and all supernatural manifestations. Later on, also, you can save the world on short notice. Also notice that it's signed by Ray Stantz, which is probably why Dustin, who went as Stantz, went ahead and busted this supernatural manifestation in his garbage. Actually, this scene with him nervously approaching Dart seems like a recreation of Stantz's first encounter with Slimer. I think there's also some Ghostbuster influence on the character Murray Bauman, the investigative reporter hired by Barb's parents. I think there's a good chance that the Duffers named Murray after Bill Murray, Spangler. After all, he is from Chicago, like Murray, and Brett Gelman definitely seems to be channeling Bill Murray's detached, wise-ass oddball persona in his portrayal of the character. Now, as I said, the 80s weren't the only decade of pop culture to influence Stranger Things, and these Jurassic Park parallels are a great example. Like when Dustin traps Dart in the basement, it evokes a scene with the kids trapping the raptor in the kitchen freezer. Also, when Steve baits the Demogorgon in the scrapyard, we get this great reveal that there are in fact several, with one closing in on Steve from the side, just like the raptor's hunting tactic in Jurassic Park. You just know Steve's like, huh, clever girl. In episode 8, the whole business with resetting the breakers was also in Jurassic Park, and perhaps Bob Newby's most heroic move was setting us straight with how computers actually work.
If you want to unlock the doors, you have to completely reboot the computer system and then override the security codes with a manual input.
Fine, how do I do that?
You can't, not unless you know BASIC.
Ah, hear that? That is the sound of nerds everywhere clapping their sweaty hands. Bob uses actual computer coding to reset the network, which feels like a sly commentary on Jurassic Park. That's right, Spielberg expected us to buy that a child could somehow operate a non-existent Unix system and swoop in through a seedy suburb of files and reboot the security system, a task that failed highly paid chief engineer Sam Jackson. I mean, I love the movie, but you know, come on. Also, this fat scientist is totally Dennis Nedry. I actually think Spielberg's earlier monster movie had a big influence as well, Jaws. Last season we saw how Chief Hopper was more or less a version of Chief Brody. Also, Will has a Jaws poster in his bedroom. This season, in episode 6, Dustin and Steve, this season's ultimate power couple by the way, use a bucket of meat to leave a trail, luring the demo dog in their direction just like Brody does with the shark. Also, while these kids wait in the scrapyard, Max remarks that the fog makes the land around them look like an ocean. Indeed, this scene with the kids bonding in the calm before the storm definitely had the feel of Brody, Quint, and Hopper in the boat cabin in Jaws. In fact, I should say this whole decision to name this season Stranger Things 2, like a movie sequel, is something that comes from Jaws as well. Before that franchise, true movie sequels didn't really exist. Like sure, the Star Wars movies had sequels, but each of them had new titles, and there was The Godfather Part 2, but really Jaws 2 was the first to just put a number after the title and more or less try to repeat the success of the first movie. Stranger Things' new title card with the big red 2 behind the word seems to be pulling from the design of Child's Play 2 or Scream 2. Another 80s movie reference I noticed was John Carpenter's The Thing. The monster prefers the cold and hates the heat and fire, even severed parts of it that aren't physically attached to the main body, just like the alien monster in The Thing. It also sets up the Thing scenario of not being able to trust the host's body, forcing you to tie the person down. I also think Will is drawing on the girl from The Exorcist, with Joyce's argument with the doctors reminding me a lot of that film. And Will's inhuman scream seemed very reminiscent of Donald Sutherland's scream in Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Of course, we have to mention the influence of Gremlins on this movie. Dustin's relationship with Dart parallels Billy's with Gizmo, down to feeding him junk food, sneaking him into school, and the hard rule against exposing him to light. Actually, Hopper's 3 rules for 11 could be a nod to the 3 rules of Gremlins. Now, like last season, Dungeons and Dragons again served as a metaphor, analogy, whatever, for the more complicated phenomena that happened. The boys use the term true sight to describe Will's ability to see in other dimensions. True sight is a real D&D ability that does, as Dustin describes, allow you to see into the ethereal plane. They also later identify the shadow monster as the Mind Flayer, describing its psionic powers and desire to enslave all other races. In D&D, the Mind Flayer is also called an illithid. It's categorized as a lawful evil, and it has a tentacled face, which may have inspired the tentacle design of this creature. But whereas last season the opening game of D&D foreshadowed the plot events of the season that followed, this season it's an arcade game. The opening scene features the boys playing Dragon's Lair, which is a real game that's super expensive, especially since it was really hard to get to the final stage. Thus why the boys had to gather a ton of quarters in the opening scenes. Here it's interesting how Dustin and Lucas butt heads over the high score in rescuing the too sexy for a kids game Princess Daphne, which actually foreshadows these two boys fighting for Max's love later on. Also, the other game of Dig Dug foreshadows the digging in underground tunnels that Hopper and the others do later in the season. There's also another 80s video game reference with the kid dressed up as Pac-Man on Halloween later. Once again this season, Hopper seems to invoke Indiana Jones, especially at the end of episode 4, with his silhouette and his hat definitely taking a very indie shape. In the next episode, he even loses his hat at one point and grabs it. And in the final episode, Nancy burns Will with a fireplace poker to weaken him and save Joyce, similar to how Short Round burns Indy with a torch to break his trance and save Willie in Temple of Doom. And then, again not an 80s reference, but Will's telepathic connection with the Shadow Monster seems at least a bit influenced by Harry Potter's connection with Voldemort in Order of the Phoenix. He and Mike realize that Will and the monster can spy on each other, that also leaves them both exposed, just like Harry and Voldemort using the legitimacy spell on each other and making them both vulnerable. I know, a bit of a stretch, but Will is the wizard of the group. And obviously there are a ton of one-off 80s pop culture references, so I'll quickly run through the others that I noticed. Max's arcade name is Mad Max, a reference to Mel Gibson Mad Max series. The nerd at the arcade calls her Road Warrior in a future episode, a reference to the sequel. On the TV, 11 sees a trailer for Terminator, which is playing at the Hawkins Hawk, right after a screening, I'm sure, of All the Right Moves starring Nancy the Slut Wheeler. 11 also watches Susan Lucci early on in her run for the soap opera All My Children. The videos Jonathan rents, if you look closely, are Mr. Mom, but also War Games and Twilight Zone the movie. Dustin named his turtle Yertle, a reference to the Dr. Seuss character Yertle the Turtle. In episode 4, notice the basketball scene set to Push It to the Limit. This is a reference to that song being used in the cheesy montage of Scarface, but it also feels like a reference to the Top Gun volleyball scene. Yeah, there is definitely a Maverick Iceman vibe between Steve and Billy later on. The character of 8, Kali, is named after the Hindu goddess Kali, the destroyer of evil forces. In the background of her hideout, there's graffiti reading O Bedlam, King Mob, and Babalith. Those are all character names from Grant Morrison's The Invisibles. It's about resistance movement fighting against people who harm those with psychic powers. Does that mean we're in store for a spin-off with Kali and her crew? Hope not. There's kind of a Star Wars vibe to 11's training with Kali. She moves a train car, similar to Luke trying to lift the X-Wing. Kali makes 11 hallucinate Dr. Brenner, just like Luke seeing Vader in the cave. And sure, she does kind of force choke this guy, kind of like Vader with Admiral Motti. Actually, on the TV in the scene, this guy's watching the sitcom Punky Brewster, specifically an episode where Punky is dreaming about scientists sticking her with needles, definitely a connection to 11 there. And Steve daring to face the Demogorgon in the scrapyard as the oldest and bravest kid seems inspired by Benny the Jet in The Sandlot, risking his life to face a monster dog in a scrapyard. The bloodbath in the Hawkins lab is delightful. It totally parallels the one in Cabin in the Woods, especially this shot with a scientist watching the horror over video monitors. Actually, Cabin in the Woods is an amazing movie that references many of the same 80s references that Stranger Things does. And Dustin's appearance in the final scene is modeled on Ducky in Pretty in Pink, down to him getting to dance with the prettiest girl there. As always with Stranger Things, the attention to detail is amazing, with a ton of 80s era branding in every frame, down to Steve quoting KFC's Finger Lickin' Good ad campaign, the classic Three Musketeers rapping, old cans of Dr. Pepper and Tab, and Steve using Farrah Fawcett's Fabergé brand hairspray. And alongside these pop culture influences were some real-world current event influence as well. You probably noticed all the Reagan-Bush signs on front yards, a reference to the 1984 election, which would have been the following week. I also like how Dustin's mom has a Mondale Ferraro's sign in her yard for the Democratic candidates who got crushed in that election. Mrs. Wheeler also mentions over the phone that she likes Margaret Thatcher. Sounded like she was debating Geraldine Ferraro as a female political role model, and Mrs. Wheeler was more of a fan of Thatcher's Reagan-style conservatism as British Prime Minister. There's also a newspaper headline reading "Babyface Baboon Heart," which was a real-life medical case that seemed like a huge breakthrough. Unfortunately, the patient died 3 months later. And speaking of tragedies, Lucas has a model of the Challenger space shuttle on his desk. Also notice the line from Mr. Wheeler in episode 2.
Understood. We're all patriots in this house.
Now, it's not surprising that Mr. Wheeler would say this, but it also helps explain how the events of season 1 were kept secret. In 80s Cold War America, loyalty to country, especially in a household like the Wheelers, was a huge deal. And if the Hawkins Lab scandal could be framed as a matter of national security, it makes sense that these families could keep quiet about it. Now, of course, there were a ton of 80s references in the Halloween party, and I'll come back to those later, but for now I want to point out the interesting connections this season made across episodes in our segment, Callbacks. In the first episode, Hopper's secretary wordlessly takes a cigarette from him, just like she does in the first episode of last season. And then notice the useless cliche Mr. Wheeler throws at his son.
So if your friend jumps off a cliff, you're gonna jump too?
Useless. Especially considering the fact that Mike, of all kids, knows what it means to literally jump off a cliff for his friend. The Millennium Falcon toy that Mike considers giving away is a callback to season 1. This is the same toy that Eleven levitated in the basement, and Mike wasn't home when she did that, making it interesting that he would feel its significance. Or maybe he just rightfully doesn't want to give away the best toy ever. Then notice what Jonathan says to Will.
Who would you rather be friends with? Bowie or Kenny Rogers?
Oh,
Exactly. It's no contest.
Now, I love this line, and it's a subtle callback to episode 4 of last season. When Will's alleged body was found in the quarry, the music that played over it was a cover of David Bowie's Heroes. The next episode makes another callback to Bob loving Kenny Rogers when he and Joyce dance to Kenny Rogers and Dolly Parton's duet, Islands of the Stream. Also, when Hopper teaches new words to Eleven, notice how he spells compromise.
C-O-M. Promise.
It's interesting that he uses the word promise because she already knows the word promise. Remember, that's the word Mike taught her in season 1.
I won't tell her about you. I promise.
promise?
Also, I like how later this season, Eleven corrects the truck driver.
515 Laramie, right?
5:15.
This is a callback to this scene with Hopper when he corrects how she says time.
515.
5:15.
When Dr. Owens shows Nancy and Jonathan through the lab, he assumes that they're together, which is kind of a callback to when he called Joyce and Hopper Mom and Pop in episode 1, assuming they were together. It's kind of interesting how in both cases that sort of ends up being true by the end of the season. In episode 7, notice what Eleven calls the asshole Chicago guy.
Mouth breather.
This is another useful word Eleven learned in season 1. Remember, she directed it at the manager of the supermarket.
Mouth breather.
And I love Steve trying to weigh in on Dustin's explanation of the mind flayer.
You know, it believes it's the master race.
Like the Germans.
This is a callback to episode 1 when Steve wrote about his grandfather's war stories in his college essay. If you think about it, his grandfather probably still called the people he fought the Germans. I also laughed when Dustin scoffed at Hopper, suggesting that they throw fireballs at the monster.
No fireballs.
This, of course, is a callback to the opening D&D game in episode 1 of season 1, when Lucas told Will to use Fireball and Dustin disagreed.
Be a pussy! Fireball him! Cast protection!
And Dustin getting to dance with Nancy at the end is a callback to that same first episode when he was crushing on her, but she wouldn't give him the time of day. I just really love how the end game of the final 2 episodes of this season really mirrored a lot of story elements from before. They worked together to create a sensory deprivation room for Will, calling back the tub that they built for Eleven last season. And this room happens to be the buyer's backyard shed, the exact same location Will initially disappeared. Hopper awesomely tosses Nancy the rifle since she's the best shot. Of course, a callback to her sharpshooting skills in season 1. And yeah, once again, pretty boy Steve gets wrecked. That makes him 0 for 2 against Jonathan and now Billy. Weird how Steve Harrington's likability is directly proportional to the number of bruises on his face. Actually, the show's self-aware treatment of Steve is one of the best examples of Stranger Things meta humor. So let's go over all the other examples in our segment, So Meta. Episode 6 gives us 2 meta nods at everyone's mixed feelings for Steve, one from Dustin.
No one is around. Why do you think I'm with Steve Harrington?
And earlier, Murray teases Nancy and Jonathan's will they won't they chemistry, and Steve's likability comes up there too.
Steve. We like Steve.
Yes!
I think my favorite line of the season was Dustin calling out Mr. Wheeler's uselessness.
Son of a bitch. You know, you're really no help at all. You know that?
This is a grown man, and he's just so checked out of the story that he only responds to Dustin's profanity here. But probably the most overt meta-commentary came from Max later this episode, after Lucas summarized the events of season 1 to her.
It's crazy, but I really liked it.
liked it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I had a few issues.
Issues?
I just felt it was a little derivative in parts.
Ah yes, Max is echoing the talking points of the critics of season 1, who liked the show but complained that it was a little too dependent on pop culture references and derivative of 80s Spielberg. It's not true. Leave Stranger Things alone. Okay, moving on now to some of the really subtle choices made by the show this season, starting with some of the audio elements I really liked in our segment, Hear That? Now, the music of Stranger Things is fantastic. Both the song selection and the score composed by Kyle Dixon and Michael Stein. I don't have time to go into how all of these songs are perfectly appropriate, so I'll just single out the final song of the season, I'll Be Watching You by The Police. Notice how right as we hear Sting sing, "Oh, can't you see you belong to me," the world rotates to the upside down version of the gym with the shadow monster looming over, watching and possessing them, reminding us that yes, this song is creepy and we should never slow dance to it. Really, I love the sound mixing this season, specifically the way it brought us into Will's head. There were key sound effects that were amplified, designed to trigger a specific emotion. In episode 1, as Will goes in for a checkup, notice how each of the straps and the plunging of the syringe play really loudly. This is meant to convey Will's anxiety, but also the shadow monster's early stages of control, as if it's worried about being detected. In episode 2, when Hopper visits with Joyce, we get this close-up of him lighting his cigarette. Listen closely to how the flick and the flame roar like a torch. This reflects Will and the Shadow Monster's resistance to fire and heat. And later in episode 4, after the Shadow Monster has fully possessed Will and Joyce draws him a hot bath, a similar torchy roar plays the moment Joyce turns on the water. All of this sound mixing is equating heat with something super threatening. Okay, moving on, let's lean in and look closely at some of these subtle visual choices made in the season in our segment, Zoom and Enhance. Okay, early in episode 1, we get this close-up of the soles of Hopper's boots on his desk. And notice how they're covered in dirt. I think this foreshadows the reveal that comes at the end of this episode, that Hopper has been secretly living with Eleven in a cabin deep in the woods. Next, in episode 2, Eleven receives a Morse code transmission from Hopper, and notice what channel number they use, 11. Episode 7 introduces us to Holli, aka 8, and if you look closely, the number 8 appears a few key times throughout this episode, right before the opening credits, and later when Eleven enters the warehouse, there's an 8 ball on the wall on the right. Now, Billy's flirting with Mrs. Wheeler in episode 9 is one of these stranger moments of Stranger Things, and I like how they set it up with this Joanna Lindsay romance novel. Check out the cover. The guy has a similar hairstyle and open chest that Billy has, kind of justifying why Mrs. Wheeler would be all over this kid. Now, this final shot of the season, as the camera tilts and rotates to the upside down, is actually foreshadowed at several key points earlier this season. The show used this same iconic camera movement in the final shot of episode 4, the final shot of episode 5, and with Bob's death in episode 8. And there's a really heartbreaking missable detail that centers around the blue bracelet that Hopper wears. So as we saw in season 1, Hopper used to have a daughter named Sarah who passed away from cancer. She wore blue hair braids, which Hopper turned into a bracelet when Sarah lost her hair from chemotherapy. He continued to wear that bracelet long after she died and has continued to wear it throughout season 2. But then in the final scene of this season, look where that braid ends up, on Eleven's wrist. Now that Hopper has legally adopted her, he has finally begun to move on from Sarah's death and begin a new family. No, you stop crying. Okay, let's close out by zooming and enhancing Tina's Halloween party in episode 2. Probably the most densely packed with details of the season. All shot in one take as the camera follows the action inside. Okay, first we get Billy doing a keg stand. There's a Like a Virgin Madonna and Alex Owens from Flashdance, Rocky from his training montage, and Johnny from The Karate Kid. And on the way inside, there's this caveman randomly hitting himself in the head. Then there's this badass with googly eye glasses shaking his head. As Billy passes him, he weirdly tugs on his toilet paper and wraps it in his hands. Nancy and Steve are dressed as Tom Cruise and Rebecca De Mornay from Risky Business, though in somewhat less memorable looks from the film. Then Nance leads us into the kitchen with more great details. Someone wrote Ragin' Sucks with Anarchist A and Sharpie on the fridge. This pure fuel guy is Bluto from Animal House. And look closely here, he uses a sponge to wipe his armpits. And some hero put the phone in the blender, because why not? Later, when Jonathan arrives, we see Bluto puke outside, and then a girl dressed as Susie Sue from the British punk band Susie and the Banshees. And shortly after that, there's a Linda Carter Wonder Woman, a workout Jane Fonda, and a Billie Jean Michael Jackson. Now, there was a really fun horror movie homage I noticed early in the season, but I covered it in my review of Stranger Things 2 on Stardust. You can download the Stardust app by clicking our link in the description below, or follow us at New Rockstars and post your reactions and tag us in them so that we can feature you in our weekly panel show show they need to know. Which pop culture influence do you think translated the best into Stranger Things 2? Aliens, Jurassic Park, Ghostbusters, Gremlins? Comment down below and tweet me your thoughts about this or about Stranger Things as a whole at Erik Voss. You can also follow New Rockstars on Twitter at New Rockstars for updates on our videos. Now, a quick thanks to Movement for sponsoring this video. Movement offers super stylish watches and sunglasses that I wear all the time. They have this sleek, minimalist design that I'm a big fan of because, as many of you have pointed out in past videos, my fashion has historically kind of sucked. Maybe this badass wolf excluding. But I think you'd be surprised how well a classy Movement watch or sunglasses cleans you up. The watches start at $95, the sunglasses $70, and you can get them polarized. Check it out. All I need now is some Farrah Fawcett Fabergé spray, and I am ready to get my ass kicked. Anyway, I love this stuff. Check it out. Get $15 off today, plus free shipping and free returns. Just go to mvmt.com/rockstars and use the code NEWROCKSTARS when checking out. Or you can click on the link in the description. Anyway, guys, join the movement. And I am not cool enough to pull that off. Like and share this video and subscribe to New Rockstars for all of our breakdowns and analysis of things that you love, like the movie It. We just had a video come out on that. And if you want to help us make more videos like this, you can contribute to us on Patreon. Big thanks to all of our current donors, especially Kenny Smith. All right, thanks for watching. Bye.